She was ignored by everyone inside the store, as if she didn't exist in that place. No one imagined that everything would change when she calmly opened her bag. What appeared to be just another ordinary customer hid something impossible to predict. If this beautiful story of overcoming and love interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching us from. Continuing. The store gleamed under strategically positioned lights, each window a silent promise of exclusivity. It was one of those boutiques on Madison Avenue in New York City, where the simple act of stepping through the door already felt like a test of belonging. The marble floor reflected the ambient light with calculated perfection, and the air conditioning maintained the exact temperature so that everything seemed impeccable, controlled, and distant from the bustle of the city outside. Claire Thompson entered around 3 in the afternoon on an ordinary Thursday. She wore discreet jeans, a simple white blouse, and comfortable sneakers. The bag she carried close to her body was leather, but without flashy brands, without logos that screamed value. To the eyes of those who knew how to evaluate quickly, she didn't seem to belong in that environment made of imported fabrics and prices that didn't need to be asked, because only those who could pay already knew how much they cost. But there was something in the way she moved. There was no rush in her steps, nor that typical anxiety of someone who feels out of place. Claire walked like someone who didn't need to prove anything, who didn't seek approval in the eyes of others. This serenity, paradoxically, made her even more invisible in that space where appearance was the currency of exchange. 2 salespeople were talking near the back of the store, laughing quietly at something one of them had said. A blonde customer, in a printed dress and high heels, was being assisted by an employee who smiled with all the attention in the world, showing piece after piece with studied enthusiasm. Claire passed by them without a single glance turning in her direction. It was as if an invisible curtain separated her from the rest of the environment. She approached a side rack, where dresses in neutral tones hung elegantly. She touched the fabric of one of them, feeling the texture between her fingers. It was pure silk, probably imported. The cut was impeccable, but no salesperson came to offer help. No approach. The silence around her was disguised as naturalness, but Claire recognized perfectly what it was. Silent exclusion. She took a deep breath and headed toward the service counter, where a young woman with her hair pulled back in an impeccable bun was typing something on the computer. The small plate on her uniform said, Sophie. Claire stopped in front of the counter and waited, patient. Sophie looked up for a fraction of a second, made a quick assessment, and went back to typing, as if she hadn't seen anything urgent. Claire waited a few more moments. Then, with a calm and clear voice, she said, Good afternoon, I need to confirm an authorization that was registered in my name. Sophie looked up again, this time with an expression that mixed surprise and slight irritation, as if she had been interrupted in something important. Authorization? The word came out accompanied by a tone that carried doubt, almost disbelief. Yes, a special request was made a few days ago. I came to get the confirmation. The employee sighed discreetly, like someone who needs to deal with something they would rather avoid. Look, this type of procedure is usually communicated by phone or email. Are you sure it was registered here? Claire held her gaze without showing any discomfort. I'm sure. Sophie didn't move to check. Instead, she crossed her arms over the counter, adopting a posture that made it clear she wasn't convinced. It's just that normally, customers with special requests already come with documentation or are expected. There's nothing in the system for today. I didn't say it was for today. I said it was registered a few days ago. Claire's tone remained calm, but there was a firmness that began to bother Sophie. The employee frowned slightly. Even so, if it were something relevant, I would know. I've worked here for 3 years. Claire didn't respond. She just continued standing there without haste, without anxiety. It was as if she already expected exactly that. On the other side of the store, near the men's section, a man observed the scene in silence. Julian Reed was 32 years old and worked as a VIP relationship manager. Unlike the ordinary salespeople, his role was to deal with special cases, high-value clients who required personalized attention, and precisely for that reason, he had developed a different perspective. Julian noticed Claire from the moment she entered. Not because she drew attention in an obvious way, but on the contrary. There was something in her discretion that contrasted with her posture. Most people who entered and were ignored became visibly uncomfortable. Some left quickly, others tried to force an interaction. But Claire simply waited, as if that were just a temporary obstacle, not a real impediment. He saw when Sophie treated her with indifference. He saw the employee's expression of disinterest, the way she didn't want to check the system, the silent decision that this customer didn't deserve her time. And that bothered him, not out of pity, but because of something he couldn't completely name. There was an incongruity there. Something didn't fit. Claire remained motionless in front of the counter. Sophie was now showing open impatience. "Look, if you don't have any proof, there's nothing I can do. Maybe there has been some mistake." There was no mistake. The answer came firmly, without aggressiveness, but with a conviction that made Sophie tighten her lips. Around them, some customers began to notice the tension. The blonde woman cast a quick glance in Claire's direction, evaluating the situation with discreet curiosity. One of the salespeople exchanged a complicit look with his colleague, as if that confirmed something they already knew. It was at that moment that Claire made a simple gesture, but one loaded with intention. She calmly opened her bag and from inside pulled out a card. It wasn't an ordinary credit card. It was black, matte, with gold details engraved in relief. She placed it on the counter without haste, without explanations. She just left it there. Sophie picked up the card with an expression that was still skeptical, but when her eyes landed on the object, something faltered on her face. She looked closer, read the engraved information, and for a brief instant, her certainty wavered. Even so, she didn't want to back down. She didn't want to admit that she might have judged wrong from the beginning. "I'll check the system," she said finally, but her tone still carried resistance. She typed the information into the computer, her fingers moving faster than necessary, like someone who wants to end this quickly. The screen loaded. The system took a few seconds longer than normal to process. Sophie looked at Claire, who remained exactly as before, serene, without anxiety, without visible expectation. Julian was now closer, pretending to organize some pieces on a rack near the counter. He could see the computer screen at a glance, and he saw when the information began to appear. The change was instantaneous. Claire's name appeared linked to an access code that only the highest standard clients possessed. It wasn't just a common authorization. It was the type of registry that came accompanied by special notes, a significant purchase history, and clear instructions for priority service. Sophie's eyes widened, the blood draining from her face as she read what completely destroyed her initial judgment. She wasn't just a customer. She was a customer the store's management knew personally. "I'll call the supervisor," Sophie stammered, trying to maintain some composure. Claire didn't answer. She just waited. Julian approached before the supervisor appeared. Not abruptly, but naturally, like someone assuming a responsibility that should have been theirs from the start. He picked up the card that was still on the counter, but he did it in a completely different way than Sophie, not as just any object, but with respect. And when his fingers brushed Claire's for a fraction of a second, there was something in that contact that neither of them expected. A silent recognition. "I apologize for the delay, Ms. Thompson," Julian said, his voice firm but respectful. "I will personally ensure that everything is resolved right now." Claire looked up at him, and for the first time since she had entered the store, she was truly seen. Not evaluated, not judged. Seen. She held his gaze for a moment that seemed to last longer than it should have. There was something in those dark eyes that didn't match the surrounding environment. A depth, an understanding that went beyond professional protocol. "Thank you," she said, and the word carried more than formal gratitude. Julian handled the rest of the service with meticulous attention. He checked every detail, organized the necessary documents, and ensured that everything was done exactly as it should have been from the beginning. Sophie remained at the side, pale, realizing the weight of the mistake she had made. Not for lack of information, but by choice. She chose not to see. Around them, the entire store seemed to have changed atmosphere. Other employees now observed Claire with renewed attention, some trying to approach to offer help that was no longer necessary. What was once invisibility transformed into focus, but Claire didn't seem impressed by the change. It was as if she already knew that would happen. When everything was finalized, she took the documents Julian handed her. Their fingers touched again, this time for longer. He didn't look away. "If you need anything," he said, "you can look for me directly." Claire nodded, a slight smile touching her lips. It wasn't a smile of satisfaction for the turnaround. It was something more subtle, more complex, as if she recognized in him something that few people possessed, the ability to see beyond appearances. She turned to leave, and as she passed through the door, she felt the weight of the eyes that now followed her. But that wasn't what marked her. What remained was that brief contact, those eyes that saw her when no one else wanted to look. Julian remained there, watching as she disappeared into the hustle and bustle of Madison Avenue. There was something in that encounter that went beyond the professional, something he couldn't explain, but that he knew he wouldn't forget any time soon. Behind him, Sophie tried to compose herself, but the awkward silence hanging over the store said it all. Sometimes the biggest mistake wasn't not knowing. It was having chosen not to see. Claire returned home that afternoon with her thoughts more turbulent than she would like to admit. The apartment was in the Upper West Side, in a discreet building, without an ostentatious gate or an imposing entrance hall. She always preferred it that way, places where she could just be herself, without the weight of the last name she carried. Upon entering, she left her bag on the sideboard and went straight to the window overlooking the avenue. New York was boiling down there, an organized chaos of horns, voices, and haste. She loved that city precisely for that. There it was possible to be invisible when she wanted, and to be seen when she chose. Claire Thompson. The name was correct but incomplete. She was Claire Thompson Sterling, granddaughter of Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, one of the most influential women in the fashion market in the country. The family matriarch had built an empire from a small garment shop in the Lower East Side decades ago and transformed it into an internationally recognized brand. Eleanor was tough, demanding, but also visionary. And Claire was her only granddaughter. Growing up under that shadow had not been easy. Since she was a child, Claire felt the weight of expectations. She should dress a certain way, frequent certain places, relate to specific people. Her mother, Grace, had died when she was only 8 years old, leaving Claire in the care of Eleanor and her father, Paul Thompson, a talented architect who never managed to fully adapt to his mother-in-law's world. Paul tried to raise his daughter with different values. He taught her that respect couldn't be bought with money, that people were worth what they were, not what they possessed. But when Claire was 15, he suffered a serious accident that kept him away from work for years. It was Eleanor who took over all the medical expenses, all the responsibilities, and Claire knew that generosity came with a silent price, eternal gratitude and obedience. At 28, Claire worked in the social responsibility area of the family business, but she always avoided taking on prominent positions. She preferred to act behind the scenes, coordinating projects that really made a difference, far from the spotlight and the social obligations she hated. Eleanor accepted that, but with reservations, always with reservations. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her grandmother. "Claire, did you go to the store today?" Eleanor's voice was firm, even at 73. "I did, Grandma." "And did they resolve everything?" "Yes, it's all resolved." There was a pause. Claire knew that silence. Eleanor was evaluating the tone, looking for something that wasn't being said. Did something happen? Claire hesitated. Part of her wanted to tell her about the treatment she received, about how she was ignored until she revealed who she really was, but another part knew that Eleanor wouldn't see it the way she did. For her grandmother, the problem would be the store, not the system that allowed it. "Nothing important," she replied. Liar. Eleanor never accepted half-truths. What happened? Claire sighed. "They treated me like I didn't belong there until I showed the card." The silence that followed was different, denser. "And were you surprised?" Eleanor's voice carried something between disappointment and realism. "Claire, you insist on walking around as if you aren't who you are. You can't complain when people believe the image you project." "I don't project any image, Grandma. I'm just me." "And who are you without the Sterling name? Without the empire I built? Do you think you can just ignore that and expect the world to treat you with respect?" Claire closed her eyes. That conversation was old, repeated in countless variations over the years. "I'm not ignoring it, Grandma. I just don't think I should use it as armor." "Then use it as a tool. The respect you want, Claire, only comes to those who make it clear they deserve it. If you hide, don't complain when they don't see you. The call ended shortly after, leaving Claire with the bitter taste of misunderstanding. Eleanor would never understand. For her, power was something to be displayed, used, protected. For Claire, it was a burden. 3 days had passed since the episode at the store. Claire tried to follow her routine, but something was different. She couldn't get that moment, that look, out of her head. Julian. She didn't even know his last name, but she remembered perfectly the way he treated her, without judgment, without surprise when the truth came out. As if somehow he already knew. It was on Saturday afternoon that she saw him again. Claire had gone to a coffee shop in Greenwich Village, a small and cozy place she frequented when she needed silence. She was sitting near the window, reading a book, when the door opened and he walked in. Julian saw her at the same moment. Their eyes met, and there was a brief second of hesitation before he smiled. It wasn't a professional smile, the kind that sells charm. It was genuine. He approached, and Claire felt her heart race in a way she didn't expect. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi. Can I sit down?" Claire nodded toward the chair in front of her. Julian sat down, and for a moment neither of them said anything. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was as if both were measuring what that encounter meant. "I'm sorry about what happened," he began. "At the store, you shouldn't have gone through that." Claire shook her head. "You don't need to apologize. It wasn't your fault. But I was there, and I took too long to act." "You did act, and you were the only one who truly saw me." The words came out before Claire could filter them, loaded with an honesty that surprised her. Julian held her gaze, and something passed between them. A silent understanding. "Do you come here often?" he asked, changing the tone to something lighter. "When I need to escape a bit. And you?" "I live nearby. I usually stop by on weekends." They talked for almost 2 hours. Julian told her that he had worked at the store for 4 years, that he had started as a salesman and rose to relationship manager. He spoke about how he hated the superficiality of the environment, but liked dealing with people when they were genuine. Claire in turn told him about her work in the social area, about the projects she coordinated, but she avoided mentioning her last name. Not yet. Julian noticed the omission, but he didn't press. There were things Claire didn't say, but he felt it wasn't out of falseness. It was protection. When they said goodbye, he asked if they could see each other again. Claire said yes without hesitation. In the following days, they exchanged messages, light conversations at first, which began to deepen. Julian had a way of asking questions that didn't seem invasive, but made her think. And Claire, for the first time in a long time, felt she could be herself without fear of judgment. It was in the second week that he found out. Julian was in the store's office reviewing the VIP client portfolio when he saw her full name in a report, Claire Thompson Sterling. His heart froze. He knew exactly who the Sterlings were. Everyone in the market knew. Eleanor Sterling was a legend, and her only granddaughter was treated as the heir to an empire. He stood still for long minutes, processing. Claire hadn't exactly lied, but she hadn't revealed it either, and now he understood why. She wanted to be seen for what she was, not for what she represented. That night, when they met again at the coffee shop, Julian decided not to mention it. Not because he wanted to hide that he knew, but because he realized Claire needed that, a space where she could just be Claire. But the truth has a way of emerging, even when we try to bury it. It was Claire who brought up the subject unexpectedly. "Julian, there's something I need to tell you." He looked at her, attentive. "I wasn't completely honest about who I am. You are Eleanor Sterling's granddaughter," he said gently. Claire's eyes widened. "You knew? I found out a few days ago at work." "And you didn't say anything?" "I thought you would tell me when you were ready." Claire felt something unravel inside her, a tension she didn't even know she was carrying. Julian didn't judge her. He didn't change the way he looked at her, and that meant more than he could imagine. "I've always been afraid that people would only see me for that," she confessed. "For the last name, for the money, never for who I really am." "I see you, Claire, and it's not the last name that makes me want to be here." They fell silent, but it was a full silence. There was something growing between them, something neither of them could completely name, but that both felt. Claire knew that was dangerous. Eleanor would never approve. A store manager, no matter how competent, didn't fit the profile her grandmother expected for her granddaughter, and her father, Paul, although more understanding, was too fragile to face Eleanor. But for the first time, Claire didn't care about approval. She cared about what she felt, and what she felt was real. The weeks that followed were different from anything Claire had experienced before. Julian entered her life with a disconcerting naturalness, as if he had always been meant to be there. They met when they could, at the coffee shop in Greenwich Village, on walks through Central Park, at simple dinners in restaurants that didn't require formality. With him, Claire laughed in a way she had forgotten. Julian had the gift of transforming ordinary moments into memories. He told stories of his childhood in Brooklyn, of a large and noisy family, so different from the solitary life Claire knew. He had grown up with little but surrounded by affection. He had worked since he was 15, helping his mother, who raised 4 children alone after their father abandoned them. "My mother is my hero," Julian said one night as they walked around the reservoir in Central Park. She worked as a housekeeper in 3 different houses, woke up at 4 in the morning, and only came back at night. But never did she let us feel that something was missing. The house always smelled of food. There were always clean clothes. There was always a lap when we needed it. Claire listened in silence, touched by the way he spoke. There was a genuine reverence there, a love that didn't need fancy words to be felt. "Does she know about me?" Claire asked apprehensively. "She knows I'm seeing someone special. I haven't gone into details yet." Julian smiled sideways. "My mother has a radar for these things. She already realized it's different." "Different how?" He stopped walking and turned to her. "You are the first person who makes me want to introduce you to my family. The first one I imagine being part of my life for real." The words fell over Claire like warm rain. She didn't know what to answer, so she just held his hand, and in due, simple gesture, she said everything. But reality didn't allow them to exist only in that bubble. A week later, Claire received a phone call from Eleanor summoning her for dinner at the Upper East Side mansion. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order disguised as a kindness. The house was imposing, with impeccable gardens and a facade that merged classic and modern. Claire had grown up there, but she never felt that place was truly a home. It was beautiful, but cold, perfect, but soulless. Eleanor was waiting for her in the dining room, sitting at the head of a table that could accommodate 20 people, but that night only housed the 2 of them. Paul, Claire's father, was traveling for work, trying to resume the career that had been interrupted by the accident. "You look different," Eleanor observed as soon as Claire sat down. "Different how?" "Lighter, less worried." Her grandmother narrowed her eyes. "Does this have to do with a man?" Claire should have expected that. Eleanor had an impressive information network. Someone must have seen her with Julian. "I am getting to know someone, yes." "Who?" Claire took a deep breath. "Julian Reed, he works at the Madison Avenue boutique." The silence that followed was glacial. Eleanor didn't raise her voice, but she didn't need to. Her disapproval was in every line of her face, in every calculated movement. "A salesman. A relationship manager for clients." "Claire, you cannot be serious." "I am completely serious." Eleanor placed her silverware on the table with excessive care, the kind of control that preceded explosions. "Do you know who you are? The position you occupy? The expectations you carry?" "I know exactly who I am, Grandma, and I know that my happiness cannot depend on others' expectations." "Others' expectations?" Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor there. "Claire, you live in this world because I built this. Everything you have, everything you are, comes from the Sterling name, and that name carries responsibilities." "I never asked to carry this name." "But you do, and you cannot simply ignore that because you fell in love with someone inadequate." The word inadequate burned like acid. Claire felt the anger rise, but forced herself to remain calm. "Julian is not inadequate. He is honest, hard-working, respectful. He sees me, Grandma, he really sees me." "He sees your money, Claire. Wake up." "You are wrong." "I am never wrong about people." Eleanor stood up, her posture regal even in her contained fury. "This story is going to end. If not by your choice, then by mine." Claire stood up too, trembling. "You can't control this." "I can, and I will." She left the mansion that night feeling the weight of a war that was just beginning. Eleanor didn't make empty threats. If she decided to act, she would act with surgical precision. Claire didn't tell Julian about the dinner immediately. She tried to move forward, to enjoy the moments they had together, but the shadow of the conversation haunted her. It was Julian who noticed something was wrong. "You're distant," he said one night as they dined at a Japanese restaurant in Brooklyn Heights. "What's happening?" Claire hesitated. Part of her wanted to protect him, to keep him away from the toxicity that was her family. But another part knew he deserved the truth. "My grandmother knows about us, and she's not happy." Julian didn't seem surprised. It was to be expected. "She thinks you're with me for the money." There was an almost imperceptible change in his expression. It wasn't hurt, but exhaustion, as if he had already heard that before, in other versions, in other lives. "And you, what do you think?" "I think she is completely wrong. But the doubt exists." Claire shook her head vehemently. "No, there is no doubt at all." Julian held her hand over the table. "Claire, I know who I am. I know where I come from, and I know that for many people, that is always going to be a problem. Not because I'm not good enough, but because the world you live in works by rules that don't include me. I don't care about those rules. But your grandmother cares, your family cares, and eventually that's going to force you to choose. It won't come to that." "It will." He spoke with a quiet sadness that broke Claire's heart. "People like your grandmother don't give up. They don't accept losing control. And you know that." Claire wanted to disagree, but she couldn't, because deep down she knew Julian was right. 2 days later, Eleanor's threat materialized. Julian was called to the store's management office. When he entered, he found not only his direct supervisor, but also 2 executives from the holding company that controlled the brand. The conversation was direct. They were restructuring the team, and his position would be eliminated. They offered a generous severance package, but the message was clear. He was being fired. Julian was not naive. He knew exactly where that came from. When he told Claire, she felt the world collapse. Guilt engulfed her like a wave. It was because of her. Everything was because of her. "I'm going to talk to my grandmother. I'm going to resolve this." "No, Claire, you're not." "Julian, you lost your job because of me." "It wasn't because of you. It was your grandmother's choice. And if you go there and beg, you'll give her exactly what she wants. Power over you, over us." "But what are we going to do?" Julian held her face between his hands. "We're going to continue. I'll get another job. I already have interviews scheduled. This isn't going to destroy us unless we let it." Claire wanted to believe him. She wanted to have the same strength he demonstrated, but the fear was greater. Fear of what Eleanor could still do. Fear that Julian would get tired of that fight. Fear that in the end, love wouldn't be enough against the weight of an empire. That night, lying in bed, Claire looked at the ceiling and realized she was at a crossroads. On one side, Julian and the possibility of a life built on freedom and truth. On the other, Eleanor and everything the Sterling name represented: security, power, but also a prison. For the first time, Claire understood that she would have to choose, and that any choice would come with a price she didn't know if she was ready to pay. The days following Julian's dismissal were marked by a tension that neither of them could completely hide. He remained optimistic when they were together, but Claire saw the weight of uncertainty in his eyes. The job interviews didn't result in anything concrete, and although he never admitted it, Claire knew the market was cruel to someone who carried the stigma of being fired from a prestigious position. It was Paul, Claire's father, who finally broke the silence she maintained with the family. He appeared at her apartment without warning on a Thursday afternoon. Claire opened the door and found her father with an expression that mixed concern and determination. "We need to talk," he said, entering without waiting for an invitation. Claire led him to the living room. Paul looked thinner, more tired than the last time they had seen each other. The accident he had suffered years ago had left sequels that still accompanied him, a slight limp, chronic pain that he tried to hide. "Your grandmother is out of control," he began, sitting on the sofa with care. "I know, Dad." "No, Claire, you don't know how far she's willing to go." Paul took a deep breath. "She hired a private investigator to research Julian's life. She wants to find something that completely disqualifies him in your eyes." Claire felt her blood run cold. "She can't do that." "She already has, and she found things." "What things?" Paul hesitated, as if he didn't want to be the bearer of that news. Julian's father. the man who abandoned the family. He had problems with drinking, debts. He was even arrested for disorderly conduct years ago. Eleanor is using this to build a narrative that Julian comes from a broken family, that he might be trying to take advantage of you, to escape a problematic past. Claire felt the anger explode inside her. His father abandoned the family when Julian was 10 years old. He has nothing to do with that man's choices. I know that, but your grandmother will use any argument she has. She's already spreading this information among those close to her, building a negative image of him before you can even defend him. Why are you telling me this? Paul looked at his daughter with an intensity he rarely showed. Because I've been through this, Claire. When I married your mother, Eleanor didn't accept me. She thought I wasn't good enough for her daughter, that I was only interested in the family money. Claire's eyes widened. She had never heard that story. She did everything she could to separate us, Paul continued, his voice heavy with old hurt. She created embarrassing situations, sabotaged job opportunities, isolated Grace socially. But your mother loved me, and I loved her. So we resisted. And what happened? Your mother had to make difficult choices, facing her own mother, setting limits, fighting. Eleanor never fully forgave us, but eventually, when you were born, she gave in. Not because she accepted me, but because she didn't want to lose her granddaughter. Claire processed that information in silence. She had never imagined that the relationship between her parents and Eleanor had been so troubled. After Grace passed away, Paul said, his voice choking up, Eleanor took control of everything. I was destroyed, in no condition to fight, and when I had the accident, I became completely dependent on her. That's when I lost any power I still had over your upbringing. Dad, you never told me any of this, because I was ashamed. Ashamed of having failed you, of not being able to protect you from her influence. Paul held his daughter's hand. But now you're going through the same thing your mother went through, and I won't stay silent again. What do you want me to do? I want you to know the truth about everything. Paul hesitated before continuing. Claire, your mother didn't just have to face Eleanor for me. She had to do it for herself too. What do you mean? Grace was passionate about music. She played the piano wonderfully, she composed. She dreamed of studying abroad, of dedicating herself to an artistic career. But Eleanor wouldn't allow it. She said it was a hobby, not a profession, that a Sterling had greater responsibilities. Claire felt a tightening in her chest. She never knew that side of her mother. Your mother gave up on her dreams so as not to lose her family, and that destroyed her inside. She loved you, she loved me, but there was a part of her that died when she gave up music. I saw it in her eyes every day. Why are you telling me this now? Because I don't want you to make the same mistake. I don't want you to give up on who you are, on who you love, out of fear of losing Eleanor's approval. Grace did that, and she paid a very high price. Tears streamed down Claire's face. It was as if all the pieces of a puzzle she never knew existed were finally fitting together. Julian is good for you, Paul said. I've seen how you've changed since you met him. You're more alive, more yourself, and that's rare, Claire, very rare. They sat in silence for a long time, father and daughter united by secrets and old pains that were finally coming to light. When Paul left, Claire was alone with her thoughts in a whirl. She needed to tell Julian everything. He deserved to know what they were facing, how far Eleanor was willing to go. They met that night on a bench in Central Park. The moon was almost full, reflecting in the water of the lake. Claire told him everything, the investigator, the information about his father, Eleanor's strategy to destroy his image. Julian listened in silence, his jaw tense, his eyes fixed on the water. I knew she would do something like that, he said finally, but I didn't think she would go this far. Julian, nothing she found changes who you are. I know, but it changes how people will see me, how your family will see me. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. My father was a weak man, Claire. He abandoned us when life got hard. My mother raised 4 children alone while he drank and ran from responsibilities. I've spent my whole life trying to be the opposite of him, and now that's going to be used against me. Not if you don't let it. It's not that simple, you know that. Claire held his face, forcing him to look into her eyes. I don't care what my grandmother thinks. I care about what I know. And I know who you are. Claire, I love you. The words came out raw, honest, loaded with a vulnerability Julian rarely showed. "But I don't want to be the reason you lose your family, your place in the world. You aren't the reason. The reason is their inability to see me as I am. And what if in the end you have to choose? If the only way to be with me is to give up everything?" Claire had no answer, because that was exactly the question that had terrified her from the beginning. Julian stood up, taking a few steps away. "Maybe your grandmother is right about one thing. Maybe I'm not good enough for you. Not because I don't deserve you, but because I can't give you the life you deserve without putting you against everyone you love." "Don't say that." "It's true, Claire, and you know it is." They stood there, separated by a few feet that felt like miles, each processing the immensity of what they were facing. It was Claire who broke the silence. "My mother gave up her dreams for fear of losing her family, and it killed her inside. My father told me today. She was a musician, she had talent, she had passion, but she gave up everything because Eleanor didn't approve." Julian turned to her. "I'm not going to make the same mistake," Claire said, her voice firm despite the tears. "I'm not going to give up on you because my grandmother can't see beyond the last name and the money. I'm not going to let her control my life like she controlled my mother's." "Claire." "I choose you, Julian. I choose us. And if that means facing Eleanor, facing the whole family, then that's what I'm going to do." Julian crossed the distance between them and hugged her tightly. And in that hug there was relief, fear, love, and the certainty that together they might survive the storm that was just beginning. But neither of them knew that the true revelation was still to come, and that it would change everything. The summons arrived in writing on company letterhead. It wasn't from the store or from Eleanor directly, but from the law firm that represented the family holding company. The envelope was delivered to Claire's apartment on a Monday morning, and when she opened it, she felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. It was a notice for an extraordinary family meeting. The subject wasn't specified, but the mandatory attendance list included Eleanor, Paul, Claire, and, to her surprise, Julian Reed. Claire called her father immediately. "What is happening?" Paul took a moment to answer. "Your grandmother called a meeting. She says she has something important to reveal, something that changes everything." "Why is Julian being summoned?" "I don't know, Claire, but I'm as confused as you are." The meeting was set for that same afternoon, in Eleanor's private office adjacent to the Upper East Side mansion. When Claire and Julian arrived together, they found Paul already waiting in the anteroom. He looked paler than ever, his eyes deep as if he hadn't slept for days. "Whatever it is," Paul whispered, "be prepared." They were led into Eleanor's office, a large room with mahogany bookshelves, artworks on the walls, and an imposing desk in the center. Eleanor was waiting for them, sitting with a posture that merged authority and something else. Something Claire couldn't completely identify, but that looked like sadness. "Sit down," Eleanor said, pointing to the chairs in front of the desk. When everyone was settled, Eleanor opened a drawer and pulled out an aged leather folder. She placed it on the desk carefully, as if she were holding something fragile. "I've spent the last few weeks investigating," she began without preamble. "Not just Julian, as you already know, but also the past, things I had buried a long time ago." Claire exchanged a look with Julian, both tense. "And I found something I never expected to find." Eleanor opened the folder and pulled out old documents, photographs yellowed by time. "Something that completely changes the situation between you." "What are you talking about, Mother?" Paul asked, his voice hoarse. Eleanor didn't answer directly. Instead, she pushed an old photograph across the desk. In it, a young woman smiled for the camera next to a man. The woman was clearly Eleanor, decades younger, but the man next to her was not Claire's grandfather. "Before I married your grandfather," Eleanor said, looking at Claire, "I loved another man, Robert Reed. We met when I was still starting out in the fashion market, working as a seamstress in the Lower East Side." Julian's breath hitched. The last name echoed in the room like a gunshot. "Robert was a tailor," Eleanor continued, her voice controlled but loaded with old emotion. "Skilled, a dreamer, passionate about his craft. We fell in love. We planned to get married, but my family wouldn't accept it. They said he was too poor, without a future, that I was wasting my potential." She paused, looking at her own hands. "I was young, insecure. My family pressured me, promised to disinherit me if I went through with the marriage, and I gave in. I broke up with Robert and married Francis Sterling, the man my family chose. A good man, I must admit, but he wasn't the love of my life." Claire felt her heart racing. Julian was pale, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. Robert was devastated. He tried to find me a few times, but I was already committed. I had already made my choice. He disappeared from the city. I never saw him again. Eleanor picked up another document, an old record. "Until my investigator found this." She slid the paper across the desk. It was a birth certificate. For Francis Julian Reed, born in 1991, son of Robert Reed Jr. and Mary Sullivan. Julian picked up the document with trembling hands. "This is my grandfather." Eleanor nodded. "Robert married years later, had 2 children. One of them was your father, who, according to the records I found, was named Robert Reed Jr. The silence in the room was deafening. Claire looked at Julian, then at Eleanor, trying to process what that meant. "You're saying," Paul said slowly, "that Julian is the grandson of the man you loved before you married my father." "I'm saying more than that." Eleanor opened another envelope and pulled out old medical documents stained by time. 2 months after I broke up with Robert, I found out I was pregnant. The world stopped. "I was pregnant with him," Eleanor continued, her voice now choked up. "But I was already committed to Francis. My family would never accept it, so I hid it. I pretended the pregnancy was Francis's, that we got married earlier than we actually did. I had the child prematurely, or at least that's what everyone believed." Paul stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Are you saying that I'm not Francis Sterling's son?" Eleanor looked at her son with tears in her eyes. "Francis never knew the truth, I made sure of it. He raised you as a son, he loved you as a son, but biologically, Paul, you are Robert Reed's son." The revelation exploded in the room like a bomb. Paul staggered, leaning against the wall. Claire couldn't breathe, and Julian was paralyzed, his eyes wide in shock. "That means," Claire whispered, "that Julian and I are second cousins," Eleanor completed, "distant but still family." Claire felt the tears flow. It was impossible. It couldn't be true, but the documents were there, irrefutable. "Why are you telling us this now?" Paul asked, his voice broken. "Why after all these years?" "Because I've spent my whole life living with this secret, Paul. I've spent my whole life hiding who I really loved, who you really are. And when I saw Claire with Julian, when I saw the way she fought for him, I realized I was making the same mistake again. I was trying to control, to decide, to protect, just like my family did to me." Eleanor stood up, approaching Claire. "You are right, my granddaughter. I cannot choose for you. I cannot decide who you should love based on money, status, or convenience, because I did that. I chose my family's approval over love, and I lived with regret every day since then." Claire looked at her grandmother, seeing for the first time the woman behind the matriarch, a woman who had loved and lost, who had kept secrets for decades, who had built an empire but lived as a prisoner of her own choices. "But now," Claire said, her voice trembling, "Julian and I are family, and that changes everything." Julian finally spoke. "We're distant cousins, there's no legal impediment." "But there's the weight of the truth," Claire replied. "How we started this without knowing, and now we know. How do we move forward?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Paul left the room, devastated by the revelation that his entire life had been built on a lie. Eleanor remained seated, vulnerable for the first time Claire could remember. Julian and Claire stood there, holding hands, facing a truth that neither of them could have predicted. "I love you," Julian said. "That hasn't changed." "I love you too," Claire replied, "but I don't know if love is enough this time." And for the first time, neither of them was sure of anything. The days following the revelation were the most difficult of Claire's life. She and Julian agreed to take some time, not for lack of love, but because of the need to process that devastating truth. They were family, distant, but still linked by blood that neither of them knew. Paul had isolated himself completely. Finding out he wasn't the biological son of the man who raised him, that his entire identity was built on a secret, destroyed him. Claire tried to visit him several times, but he asked for space, time to rebuild what had collapsed. Eleanor, surprisingly, was the one who changed the most. The matriarch, who always seemed unshakable, now showed cracks in her armor. She sought Claire out a week after the revelation, appearing at her granddaughter's apartment without warning, something she had never done before. "Can I come in?" she asked, and Claire realized it was the first time her grandmother had asked permission for anything. They sat in the living room, a strange silence hanging between them. Eleanor looked smaller, more fragile, stripped of the authority she always wore like a second skin. "I spent my whole life believing I had made the right choice," Eleanor began. "Marrying Francis, building the empire, ensuring stability. I thought Robert's love was a weakness, something I needed to sacrifice to be successful." Claire listened in silence. "But the truth is that I sacrificed the only thing that really mattered, and I carried that regret every day. When I had Grace, your mother, I tried to make up for it. I gave her everything money could buy, but I didn't give her freedom. I didn't give her permission to be who she really was." "Why not?" "Because I was afraid. Afraid she would make the same mistakes I did. Afraid of losing control. And in the process of trying to protect her, I ended up suffocating her." Eleanor wiped away the tears that fell. "When Grace passed away, I lost the chance to fix that. And I swore I wouldn't make the same mistake with you." "But you did." "Yes, I did." Eleanor looked directly at Claire. "And when I saw you with Julian, when I realized I was trying to control you the same way, I knew I had to do something different. That's why I investigated. Not to destroy him, but to understand. And I found the truth that I myself had buried." Claire felt something break inside her. All that time she had seen Eleanor as the antagonist, the force trying to separate them. But now she understood that her grandmother was fighting her own battles against ghosts from the past. "Do you think I should stay with Julian?" Claire asked, vulnerable. "I think you should do what your heart tells you. And if you're going to stay with him, you need to know that you have my blessing. Not because he's Robert's grandson, but because he makes you happy. Because your love is real. And I've already wasted too much love in my life to try to destroy yours." They hugged, and in that hug there were decades of pain, secrets, and finally understanding. But Claire still didn't know what to do about Julian. It was Paul who, weeks later, brought the perspective she needed. He appeared at her apartment on a Sunday afternoon, looking lighter than in recent weeks. There was still pain in his eyes, but also an acceptance that wasn't there before. "I talked to Eleanor," he said. "We talked for real for the first time in decades. She told me everything about Robert, about who he was, what they dreamed of together, why she gave up." "And how are you feeling?" "Confused, hurt, but also understanding." Paul sat down next to his daughter. "Francis Sterling may not have been my biological father, but he was my father in everything that matters. He raised me. He loved me. He taught me how to be a man. Blood doesn't erase that." Claire nodded, her eyes tearful. "And I realized something else, Claire. The truth about my origin doesn't change who I am. I am still Paul Thompson. I am still an architect. I am still your father. I am still Grace's son, and in a way Francis's too. The past doesn't define who we choose to be." But in the case of Julian and me, the past created a blood connection. "Her distant connection," Paul corrected. "Second cousins. Legally, there's no impediment. Morally, it depends on how you two view it. And how should we view it?" Paul held his daughter's hand. "You met without knowing. You fell in love without there being any intention of manipulation or family gain. Your love was born pure, genuine. And discovering that there's a distant blood connection shouldn't erase all that." "But it's strange, Dad. It's complicated." "Life is complicated, Claire. And if we stay paralyzed by every complication, we never truly live. Your mother knew that. That's why she fought to stay with me, even when Eleanor didn't approve. And even though she didn't have the ending she deserved, she lived with love while she could. She didn't waste the time she had." Claire processed those words in silence. "Do you love Julian?" Paul asked. "Yes." "And does he love you?" "Yes." "Then you have a choice to make. Do you let the past and unexpected revelation destroy something real? Or do you decide that your love is bigger than the circumstances that brought you here?" That night Claire called Julian. They met at the same bench in Central Park where they had talked so many times before. The moon was again almost full, mirroring in the water as it did the first time. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," Claire said. "Me neither." "Julian, what Eleanor revealed changed everything, but at the same time it changed nothing. I'm still me, you are still you, and what I feel for you is still real." Julian looked at her with those eyes that always saw her for real. Claire, I spent weeks thinking about this. I consulted experts, I read about legislation, I talked to my mother, and you know what they all told me? That there's nothing wrong. We are second cousins, a connection so distant that in many countries it's not even considered close kinship. But do you feel different, knowing we're family? Julian thought before answering. I feel connected to you in an even deeper way, as if the universe conspired to bring us together. Our grandparents loved each other decades ago, and now we found each other without knowing and fell in love. That's not a coincidence, Claire. It's destiny. Do you believe in destiny? I believe in us. Claire felt the tears flow. For weeks she had carried the weight of uncertainty, the fear that love wouldn't be enough. But there, at that moment, she realized she already had the answer. She always had. I believe in us too, she said. Julian pulled her into a hug, and in that simple gesture there was liberation. Liberation from fear, from guilt, from the weight of expectations. They were no longer fighting against the world. They were choosing each other, consciously, fully. In the months that followed, much changed. Eleanor started therapy, something she had always resisted, but now embraced as a way to finally make peace with her past. She approached Paul in a genuine way, trying to repair decades of control and distance, and although the road was long, there was hope. Paul resumed his career as an architect with renewed strength, this time without the weight of owing gratitude to anyone. Eleanor ensured he had complete autonomy, without interference, without silent demands. It was the least she could do. Claire continued her work in the social area, but now with a more active voice in the company. Eleanor finally recognized that her granddaughter had important visions, perspectives that the empire needed. And for the first time, Claire felt she could contribute without losing her identity. Julian got a better job at a fashion consultancy, where his talent for client relationships flourished, without the limitations of his previous store. He officially met Claire's family, not as an intruder, but as part of it. And although there was initial awkwardness, there was also acceptance. A year after the meeting in the store, Claire and Julian decided they were ready to take the next step. They were married in an intimate ceremony in the garden of Eleanor's house, with the people who really mattered. Paul walked his daughter down the aisle, his eyes shining with pride and emotion. Eleanor cried throughout the ceremony, not out of sadness but out of relief, as if she could finally forgive herself for the mistakes of the past, upon seeing that her granddaughter would not repeat them. When the couple exchanged vows, they spoke not only of love but of choice, of respect, of seeing and being seen. And everyone there understood that the marriage was more than the union of two people. It was the healing of generations of pain, control, and regret. Claire looked at Julian that day and remembered the first time he truly saw her, when she entered the store as invisible and left as seen, and she realized that had been the beginning of everything. Not just the romance, but her own transformation. Because being seen by someone who truly looks is the greatest gift we can receive. And when we reciprocate, when we see back, we create something indestructible. The biggest mistake was never not knowing. It was having chosen not to see. But Claire and Julian chose differently. They chose to see, and by making that choice, they found not only love but freedom. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Claire and Julian touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of love, difficult choices and transformation, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment most marked you. Was it Eleanor's revelation? Claire's strength in facing her family? The love that resisted even in the face of the impossible? Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, the conflicts we